Today we're going to be in Genesis chapters 25 through 27. And we're not going to be reading two chapters today. That's what we're going to be talking about. I hope you are getting a chance to enjoy the summer, and it is good to be back today. It's good to have Abby and David back with us. What a wonderful time of worship. I can hardly believe it, but in less than 3 weeks, you'll be sending a small team of us out to pursue the Great Commission in Nicaragua. And with that, some of you have been asking what you can do to help if you can't make it with us. And so today, I just want to take a second to explain on that a little more. The first and most important thing you can do is be there on August 18th, Sunday, August 18th. We're going to pray over both us, the team we're sending out, and the Nicaraguans we're going to be ministering to. We're also going to devote a specific portion of the service just to receive those prayers and your support, probably through the laying on of hands, just like the early church did with Paul and his missionary companions when they sent him out in the book of Acts. But another thing you can do if you're seeking to help us with practical matters is simply to give to the mission work and Project Hope in Nicaragua through their website. It's pjhope.org/Nicaragua, pjhope.org/Nicaragua. And there's going to be a variety, you'll see on the website, there's a variety of different ministries that you can support that we are going to be in on while we're down there on our mission trip. And so the reason I'm asking that financial support be given to them and not to us personally is that they have everything set up down there. They have all the supplies, the materials, that we'll be working through them. So that would make the most sense if you want to help in a practical way, to just go online and support their work. But I just wanted to make that clear, just in case anybody had questions that had to set it. That's one way you can be aware and support the trip if you can't make it. But with that understood, we're going to change gears and return to our study on returning to the foundations in the book of Genesis. Last week we looked into Abraham's test in chapter 22 when God asked him to sacrifice Isaac. But today we're going to move on from Abraham to talk about Isaac's dysfunctional family in Genesis 25 through 27. Now, some of you might be surprised to hear me use the word dysfunctional about one of the patriarchs, but after today, I think you might understand why. The fact of the matter is, the Bible doesn't hide the reality of the brokenness of humanity. In fact, it exposes it even in those we would do well to look up to. That said, some of what's in the Bible is there to show us what not to do. And when it comes to this section that we're going to be covering today, that is most certainly the case. Now, when it comes to the narrative genre in the Bible, often one story or even one part of a story can span across multiple chapters, and the narrative of Jacob and Esau is no different. So here's what we're going to do. First, I'll give you kind of a 10,000-foot view of what we're going to be going into today with Genesis 25 through 27. And then later, as we go along, we're going to dive into different scenes in the story in detail as we walk through specific passages in order of when they happened. If that isn't making sense now, it will later, but let's just start off with a general summation of the story we're going to be looking at today. And remember, this is a true story. Once upon a time, Abraham's son Isaac had two twin sons named Jacob and Esau. Jacob was the younger son and Esau was the firstborn son, which meant that culturally speaking, Esau was the rightful recipient of his father's blessing. Now, this blessing was important because it was the father's opportunity to speak words of peace and prosperity over the next generation, and it was believed that his words would carry a prophetic weight for the future reality. However, at an early age, Esau carelessly sold his birthright to Jacob for a bowl of soup because he was hungry. But clearly, it didn't seem to do much good, because later on, when they grew up, Isaac, who was almost blind and nearing death, called on Esau to go on a hunt to prepare a delicious meal so that he could give him the blessing. But that's where things started to get dicey, because Rebekah, Isaac's wife, overheard it and asked Jacob to pretend to be his brother and fake his own wild game meal so that he could receive the blessing instead. In the end, Jacob accepted the plan with very little consideration for the consequences and carried it out to completion until he had successfully lied to his father. After Jacob got what he came for and left, Esau came in with the kill, and a lot of things went south after that. Now, to be honest with you, there's a lot more to that story than we're going to be able to cover today, but one thing about these famous chapters in the Bible is absolutely clear. Everyone involved set a bad example. And I realize that sounds extreme, but what we're going to learn today is that Isaac, Rebekah, Esau, and Jacob made a total of 5 mistakes that we would do well not to repeat. Now, if you're wondering why there are 5 mistakes and only 4 characters, first of all, you're listening well, so thank you. But that is because Isaac actually made 2 mistakes. That said, let's go ahead and begin with his first one, which I'm calling an overlooked omen. An overlooked omen. Now, in reality, the word omen can mean a lot of different things, depending on the context. But today, I'm using the word omen to describe the prophecy that God revealed to Rebekah before Esau and Jacob were even born in Genesis 25, 21 through 26. So that's the first place we're going to dive in to get the details of our story today. And again, we'll be starting in verse 21 of chapter 25. Here's what it says. Isaac prayed to the Lord on behalf of his wife because she was childless. The Lord was receptive to his prayer, and his wife Rebekah conceived. But the children inside her struggled with each other. And she said, "Why is this happening to me?" So she went to inquire of the Lord. And the Lord said to her, 2 nations are in your womb. 2 peoples will come from you and be separated. One people will be stronger than the other, and the older will serve the younger. When her time came to give birth, there were indeed twins in her womb. The first one came out red-looking, covered with hair like a fur coat, and they named him Esau. After this, his brother came out grasping Esau's heel with his hand. So he was named Jacob. So if you can't tell, their names have to do with how they were born and who they were, which is the case in Hebrew culture. Isaac was 60 years old when they were born. Now, after reading that, notice what it doesn't say. It doesn't say, when Rebekah told Isaac what the Lord had said, Isaac sought the Lord to inquire of him what he should do. In fact, it mentions nothing about Isaac's reaction whatsoever to the prophecy, and it appears as though they went on with their lives, as if nothing ever happened. In fact, it's worse than that, because verse 28 says that Isaac loved Esau and Rebekah loved Jacob. So that means Isaac was choosing completely to overlook and discount what God had spoken to his wife, to the point that he was showing favoritism to Esau at Jacob's expense. Of course, the ultimate proof that Isaac overlooked the omen was that he gave Esau the blessing. Because that means that there's no way that Isaac took what God said to Rebekah seriously. Otherwise, he wouldn't have tried to go against God's will. But you see, Isaac had his own plan for the future of his children. And being the head honcho, he decided that maybe Rebekah had an off day and wasn't actually hearing from God after all. But boy, did that come back to bite him. That said, the application on this one is just for you husbands out there. And I'll cut right to it. Don't ignore your wife. Don't ignore your wife. Wives, you can go ahead and sit back and take it easy on this one. But husbands, we won't stay on this point forever. Listen, earlier in this series, as we were working through Genesis 2, I spent a lot of time talking about gender roles and God's calling on a man's life to lead and a wife to submit, and how that represents God's own Trinitarian nature. But men, don't let that go to your head and make you think that you don't need your wife's guidance and involvement. In our story today, God spoke to Rebekah, not Isaac. And Isaac didn't listen to her. So here's what I'm saying. Don't make the same mistake he did. Listen to your wife's intuition. Take the time to ask her what she's hearing from God and what she's learning from the Bible, and take what she says seriously. Ephesians 5:28 says this, "In the same way, husbands are to love their wives as their own bodies. He who loves his wife loves himself." Now, for our purposes today, here's how that can be applied. If you value what you have to say, you had better at least consider what she has to say. If you value what you have to say, you'd better at least consider what she has to say. She has a calling to honor God by submitting to you, and the worst thing that you can possibly do is take advantage of that. Now, I'm not saying she's always right or that there isn't a place for asking that she follow your leadership when she doesn't agree with you on something from time to time. But at the end of the day, you will be responsible for how you lead your family. And if you do what Isaac did, your family's going to wind up like his. Dysfunctional. Don't ignore your wife. Okay, husbands, you can breathe again, because the next point is for everyone. The second mistake we can learn from today is from Esau, and I'm calling it a hasty hunger. Hasty hunger. You could also call it a hunger for haste, either way. But we're talking about Esau's obsession with fast, easy, and temporary fulfillment. For this one, let's hop over to chapter 25, verses 27 through 34, and take a look at what happened when Jacob and Esau were beginning to grow from boys to men. Starting in verse 27, Moses writes, "When the boys grew up, Esau became an expert hunter, an outdoorsman, but Jacob was a quiet man who stayed at home. Isaac loved Esau because he had a taste for wild game, but Rebekah loved Jacob. Once, when Jacob was cooking a stew, Esau came in from the field exhausted. He said to Jacob, 'Let me have some of that red stuff, because I'm exhausted.' That is why he is called Edom. Jacob replied, 'First, sell me your birthright.'" Oh, he's got him. "Look," said Esau, "I'm about to die, so what good is a birthright to me?" Jacob said, "Swear to me first." So he swore to Jacob and sold his birthright to him. Then Jacob gave bread and lentil stew to Esau. He ate, drank, got up, and went away. So Esau despised his birthright. Now, before we just lay into Esau here, we need to try and at least be fair. Because let's get real, it's not like he was sitting in a deer stand somewhere with a cooler full of snacks, right? He's not chilling. It's not like hunting we know it today. He didn't pull through McDonald's for a Big Mac and a Coke after his hunt, None of that. This was survival hunting. And I'm willing to bet that Esau was famished in a way that only a few of us may have ever experienced. That said, at the end of the day, Esau made his choice, and he prioritized what was here today and gone tomorrow over his entire future. And I think verse 34 says a lot about Esau when it says he ate, drank, got up, and went away. I just get the feeling when I read that that's something that could have been written on his gravestone. And if not for the following verses, I probably wouldn't be so quick to jump to that conclusion. But check out verses 34 and 35 at the end of chapter 26. Here's what it says. "When Esau was 40 years old, he took as his wives Judith, daughter of Beri the Hethite, and Basemath, daughter of Elon the Hethite," not Elon Musk, "and they made life bitter for Isaac and Rebekah." Now, in case you're confused, the Hethites would later become known as the Hittites, so the two groups of people are more or less the same. But the main issue here is that they were one of the nations of Canaan. That said, the problem of intermarrying with the Canaanites, aside from the fact that it was strictly forbidden by God in the book of Exodus later on, is that Esau clearly did not seek to honor his parents' wishes in this. Abraham's dying act was to make his servant swear to Isaac to keep from marrying a Canaanite woman. These foreign wives made life bitter for Isaac and Rebekah because they didn't follow the same God or practice the same way of life. But Esau didn't pay attention to any of that at all. Instead, he was just being a typical man. And he said, "Hey, let me have some of that hot stuff there." And that was the end of it. So the first appetite he recklessly filled was for food, and the second appetite was for the other thing that men like. Point being, Esau was in a hurry to satisfy temporary cravings at the expense of what actually mattered. That said, the lesson we can learn from this mistake is simple. Don't idolize your appetite. Don't idolize your appetite. And when I say appetite, I'm not just talking about food, right? It can mean a lot of different things. But I do want to make a distinction here, because God made us to be creatures of desire. There's nothing wrong with being hungry or craving something delicious or desiring to win a competition or buy a certain car. It's also not a sin to have a physical desire for sex. God made us all with that desire. The problem is in how quickly those desires can become a sinful obsession that makes us forget God and His ways. In other words, the issue is not that we have desires, but that we tend to want to idolize them and take them beyond their God-given limits. That said, the next best question is, how do we keep that from happening? Right? I mean, how do we keep our desires in their rightful place before a holy God and what He wants for our lives? Well, the answer comes down to just one word: discipline. The Apostle Paul talked about the importance of discipline in 1 Corinthians 9:27 when he wrote this. Instead, I discipline my body to bring it under strict control so that after preaching to others, I myself will not be disqualified. What that means is that discipline is really a matter of bringing your own desires under strict control. Desires that, if left unchecked, could lead to disaster. That said, maybe it would help to remember it this way. Discipline is like God's fireplace for the burning flames of your own desires. Discipline is like God's fireplace for the burning flames of your own desires. Listen, an uncontained fire can bring you warmth, light. A contained fire can bring you warmth, light, and joy. But an uncontained fire can bring untold destruction. Discipline is God's fireplace for your life, for your desires. That said, I can personally attest to this with the fact that if you forget to practice discipline in your life, your desires will, absolutely will, become an idol. There's absolutely no way around it. Personally, I've tried to make some efforts in this area recently. One thing about me is that I hate exercise. Can I get an amen? Anybody? All right, okay. Now I know you're not judging me. Okay. But I do. I don't like it at all. But every day, with the exception of Thursday and Friday night, I do 60 crunches and 20 push-ups. And maybe I do that to stay in shape a little, but honestly, I mean, that's very little. I would do more if that was my goal. The real reason I started doing that was because it gave me more of something I've learned to treasure, and that thing is discipline. And when you get your mind and your body into a pattern of saying no to your desires, it carries over to every other area of your life. So, what I'm telling you this morning is that it doesn't matter how or in what way you decide to add discipline into your life. If you are consistent, you will develop a strength to say no to whatever it is that you sometimes struggle with. That said, it is not my intention to lead anyone astray this morning either, because there is another necessity in your fight against idolizing your appetite, and it's prayer. Prayer. Discipline will only get you so far. But at the same time, my point today is that you can't do without it. And listen, discipline is not something you can just conceptualize into existence, that if you think about it enough, you've got it. It doesn't work that way. It's something you have to do, and do on a regular basis. And if you struggle with being overwhelmed with your desires often, then you may just have to be more disciplined than others. Because the error of Esau's hurried hunger shows us not to idolize our appetite, and the best way to do that is to get some discipline. Moving on, the third mistake that we can learn from today is an unsanctioned scheme. An unsanctioned scheme. Let's read as the story picks up in chapter 27, verse 1. Many years after Esau gave up his father's blessing to Jacob. Moses writes, when Isaac was old and his eyes were so weak that he could not see, he called his older son Esau and said to him, my son, and he answered him, here I am. He said, look, I am old and do not know the day of my death. So now take your hunting gear, your quiver and bow, and go out in the field, hunt some game for me. Then make me a delicious meal that I love and bring it to me to eat so that I can bless you before I die. Now Rebekah was listening to what Isaac said to Esau. So while Esau went to the field to hunt some game to bring in, Rebekah said to her son Jacob, listen, I heard your father talking with your brother Esau. He said, bring me game and make a delicious meal for me to eat so that I can bless you in the Lord's presence before I die. Now, my son, listen to me. The time is now. Do what I tell you. Go to the flock and bring me 2 choice young goats, and I will make them into a delicious meal for your father. the kind he loves. Then take it to your father to eat, so that he may bless you before he dies." Now, what I want you to see from what we just read is that this clever plan was clearly not something that Rebekah had ever asked God about. Otherwise, she wouldn't have used deception as her primary weapon in fixing this mess. The other thing I want to point out here is that Rebekah put Jacob in a spot that no mother should ever put their child in. She actually communicated to Jacob that participating in this lie was his duty in obeying her. That's really not fair. However, Jacob was a grown man at this point, and that didn't exempt him from the responsibility of making his own mistakes either, as we're soon going to see. But the point I'm making right now is that Rebekah's plan to pursue God's will by employing the enemy's tactics was not a good idea at all. I mean, what if Rebekah had tried to talk with Isaac? What if she had pleaded with God and asked him what she should do? Well, obviously, we're not told that, but who knows? Maybe this painful family mess could have been avoided, or at least made a little bit better. But that leads us to the application, which is this: don't imitate Satan to honor God. Don't imitate Satan to honor God. Doesn't work. And it sounds really simple and easy and duh. But I actually believe we try to do this as Christians more often than we think. Honestly, the whole concept kind of reminds me of Star Wars. Now, if you are a Star Wars nerd out there, please give me grace. If there's exceptions to what I'm about to say in the books, okay, just work with me, okay? Work with me. But the original 6 movies with George Lucas, there was a common understanding that the Jedi were forbidden from using the powers of the dark side, right? And in fact, part of what turned Anakin into Darth Vader was the belief in the lie that he could, use the powers of the dark side to accomplish good in saving Padme. However, the truth was that the power of the Sith and their tactics was inseparable with their evil ways. There's a connection here. The connection is that it's the same way with Satan, who, to be clear, is very powerful, like the dark side. The Bible calls him a deceiver and one who steals, kills, and destroys. He discourages, he hates, he falsely accuses, he tempts. Those are his ways. And as believers, what do you think we're tempted to do when we come face to face with our enemies and our persecutors and those we don't like? We're tempted to use the powers of the dark side to overcome evil with more evil, to tear down those who tear us down, to discourage, hate, and even falsely accuse them so that we can put them down. Sometimes that's exactly what we want to do. But the Bible says otherwise in Romans 12, 17 through 21, which says this: "Do not repay anyone evil for evil. Give careful thought to do what is honorable in everyone's eyes. If possible, as far as it depends on you, live at peace with everyone. Friends, do not avenge yourself. Instead, leave room for God's wrath, because it is written, 'Vengeance belongs to me. I will repay,' says the Lord. But if your enemy is hungry, feed him. If he is thirsty, give him something to drink. For in so doing, you will be heaping fiery coals on his head. Do not be conquered by evil, but conquer evil with good." That could never be said enough right now. Listen, Isaac was wrong to ignore what God said to Rebekah, and Esau acted in a way that should have given his father at least a little bit of pause, at the very least, and whether or not he was going to give the blessing to Esau. But Rebekah should never have chosen to employ one of Satan's tactics to fix the situation. Because we aren't called to conquer evil with evil, but to overcome evil with good. And yes, in the end, Jacob did receive the blessing, and God's will was fulfilled, but not without a broken home, a runaway situation, and decades worth of unnecessary fear on Jacob's behalf. So take it from Anakin. You should never attempt to accomplish good by using the powers of the dark side. That said, Rebekah wasn't the only one to blame here, because Jacob agreed to the plan, right? He went along with it. And he stuck to it, even when the level of deception went through the roof. That's why I'm calling the fourth mistake a cursory consent. because Jacob's decision to take part in Rebekah's scheme, it was rushed, and he failed to think through what other options might look like. But before we dive in any deeper, let's take a look at what it says in verses 11 through 27 of chapter 27, starting with verse 11. Moses writes, and pay close attention to how much lying had to happen for this thing to be successful. Starting with verse 11, Jacob answered Rebekah, his mother, look, my brother Esau was a hairy man, but I am a man with smooth skin. Suppose my father touches me, then I will be revealed to him as a deceiver and bring a curse rather than a blessing on myself. His mother said to him, your curse be on me, my son. Just obey me and go get them for me. So he went and got the goats and brought them to his mother. His mother made the delicious food his father loved. Then Rebekah took the best clothes of her older son Esau, which were in the house, and had her younger son Jacob wear them. She put the skins of the young goats on his hands and the smooth part of his neck. Then she handed the delicious food and the bread she made to her son Jacob. When he came to his father, he said, my father. And he answered him, here I am. Who are you, my son? Jacob replied to his father, I am Esau, your firstborn. I have done as you told me. Please sit up and eat some of my game so that you may bless me. I just kind of picture him like lowering his voice here, like the outdoorsman hunter, like, I'm Esau. So Jacob came closer to his father Isaac. Skipped verse 20. But Isaac said to his son, how did you ever find it so quickly, my son? He replied, because the Lord your God made it happen for me. Then Isaac said to Jacob, please come closer so I can touch you, my son. Are you really my son Esau or not? So Jacob came closer to his father Isaac. When he touched him, he said, the voice is the voice of Jacob, but the hands are the hands of Esau. He did not recognize him, but the hands were hairy like those of his brother, so he blessed him. Again he asked, are you really my son Esau? And he replied to him, I am. Then he said, bring it closer to me, and let me eat some of my son's game so that I can bless you. Jacob brought it closer to him, and he ate. He brought him wine, and he drank. Then his father Isaac said to him, please come closer and kiss me, my son. So he came closer and kissed him. Yikes, right? Ugh, tense, lying. Isaac was totally on to them. I mean, he was asking the right questions. He knew something wasn't right. But Jacob just kept at it. And that's what you wind up having to do when you tell a lie. You have to go farther with it than you wanted to go, a lot farther. In this instance, Jacob had to top it all off with a kiss, which kind of reminds me of another scene in the Bible. But also notice the fact that Jacob's concern with the plan wasn't a matter of right and wrong, but a matter of how bad it would be for him if he got caught. That is a huge indicator that Jacob's heart was not in the right place. That said, I'm not exactly sure how much of it had to do with ill will versus ignorance and a lack of decision-making skills to at least some degree, because the fact of the matter is Jacob was a grown man, but he was also led astray by the person that he trusted the absolute most. Let's remember the fact that Rebekah presented Jacob with two options. The first option was to lie. The second option was to disobey her. That's tough because he already knew he wasn't pleasing to Isaac. So to risk failing Rebekah also, that would almost be too much pain for him to imagine. So in some ways, I think Jacob just decided to do the only thing that he could do in his mind. But my point is, if he had thought through the situation himself, he would have considered other options than the two that were given to him. He could have asked Rebekah to talk to Isaac or pray with him for help. He could have decided to let Esau naturally give up the blessing over time by his own conduct as the future unfolded, which would have been likely. Or he could have mentioned to Isaac that his brother sold his own birthright. Important detail. But in the end, Jacob decided to go along with the situation he was given instead of trying to rise above it, and that leads to the application today, which is this: don't implement a lose-lose solution. Don't implement a lose-lose solution. One of my favorite subjects in college was philosophy from a Christian worldview. And probably the most fascinating and practical thing that I ever learned about were logical fallacies. Logical fallacies, which are basically common false arguments. Now, if you know logical fallacies well, you can often spot them in debates, speeches, and yes, even marital disagreements. Although I would recommend discretion on that last one. But one of the more well-known ones is called the either-or fallacy. Either-or fallacy. And it's employed when someone says there are only two possible options to a problem, when in reality, there are more. That said, the thing about that particular fallacy is that it can really cloud our judgment when, we're making decisions. And so the most important thing you can learn to do is to become good at spotting that in your own life. And I'm not saying there are never two options for a decision by any stretch. Sometimes it's either one way or the other in your life. But I am saying that sometimes we get backed into a corner, either by our own thinking or somebody else's, and we don't think about climbing out the window behind us. And there's no real way to explain what that moment looks like for you and for me. But I can tell you this. If you've got a problem on your hands, and it seems like there's only two options that would both mean losing in God's sight, then don't accept either one. Don't accept either one. Look for another solution. Proverbs 4:26 through 27 says it this way: carefully consider the path of your feet, and all your ways will be established. Don't turn to the right or to the left. Keep your feet away from evil. Moving on, the fifth and final mistake to learn from today is a botched blessing. A botched blessing. And we can read all about it in Genesis 27 through 29, right after Jacob successfully deceived Esau. Here's what it says. When Isaac smelled his clothes and blessed him and said, the smell of my son is like the smell of a field. The Lord has blessed. May God give to you from the dew of the sky and from the richness of the land an abundance of grain and new wine. May peoples serve you and nations bow and worship to you. Be master over your relatives. May your mother's sons bow and worship to you. Those who curse you will be cursed, and those who bless you will be blessed. Now, the first thing I need to address is that all the smelling going on in verse 27 is just a little bit odd. Because I don't know about you, but I am red, right? I am at least somewhat hairy. But when I come home from hunting, nobody's dying to get a whiff of me. I could tell you that. That has never happened. Ever. So that's the first thing that's kind of messed up about this whole scene. Right? But really the big problem is with Isaac's blessing, and that it's not really about God. It's about Esau. It's way more about Esau than about God. I mean, this was a far cry from the blessing that God gave to Abraham and to Isaac, and it's nothing like what God told Rebekah. There was never anything about nations bowing in worship to Esau or to Jacob. So what I want to highlight this morning is that Isaac really messed up on this part, because it was supposed to be about God's covenant relationship with his people and how God would bless the nations through them, not other nations idolizing his son. That said, in time, Jacob himself would bless all of his sons later in the book of Genesis. And God used that to specifically prophesy about the future tribes of Israel. So it's not like Isaac was completely off in getting specific with Esau. But the real problem here is that he made his son the object of worship instead of God. And that leads us to the final application, which is this: don't idolize your children. And yes, that's a second idolize. There's no better word. Don't idolize your children. Listen, parents, kids need encouragement. They need to be told when they're good at things. They need to know you love them with all of your heart. But they also need to be corrected a lot. And here's the truth. If you make your kid your number one priority in your life, few things could hurt them more. They can't handle it, and neither can you. And here's why. If God is not in first place in your heart, you will expect whoever is in his place to be just as good and just as perfect as he is. And that will always kill your relationships. Don't put people in God's place, including your children. The reality is that, biblically speaking, your relationship should be in this order. Number one, God. Then way down the list, after pages and pages about God, should be your spouse at number 2. Then after that would be your kids at number 3. But before you just immediately accept that as truth in your own life, I want to challenge you to stop and evaluate whether or not you actually live that out. Is your number 3 in the number 3 position when it comes to the decisions you make? Or do your kids' wishes actually prevail over your spouse's? Is God really in the number 1 position, or do you let your kids keep you from what He wants to do in your life? Listen, wherever you're at on this, please understand this is not a given. Not a given. We live in a society where it's flat out encouraged that parents almost worship their children and let them control their lives. But church, it is not to be so among you. And folks, I'm not just talking to young parents either. I'm talking to parents of adult children right now. Be careful. Be careful not to let the feelings, thoughts, and actions of your adult children control your life. Be sure that you are entrusting them in God's care and turning those worries into prayers. Because one of the most important lessons for a human being to learn is that we are not the gods of our own universe. And parents, no one can teach your kids that one except you. In Luke 14:26, Jesus said this: "If anyone comes to me and does not hate his own father and mother, wife and children, brothers and sisters, yes, and even his own life, he cannot be my disciple." So what does that mean? Well, what it means is that we're called to put God on the throne of our hearts without leaving any room for our kids or anyone else in our family to sit there also. So I do want to ask you this morning to please guard your hearts and to seriously evaluate your priorities and if they are straight or not. The best thing you can do is to ask someone you trust about. Ask them. Ask them to tell you what they would say your number 1, number 2, and number 3 relationships are. And to be honest, sometimes I do that with my wife, and it always helps me stay on track, though it has the potential to be painful. But with that understood, that concludes the final mistake that we can learn in the story of Jacob and Esau today. So let's review. First, we learned as husbands not to ignore our wives from Isaac's overlooked omen. Second, we learn not to idolize our appetites from Esau's hurried hunger for what's here today and gone tomorrow. Third, we learn not to imitate Satan to honor God from Rebekah's unsanctioned scheme. Fourth, we learn to avoid implementing a lose-lose situation or solution from Jacob's cursory consent to Rebekah's deceptive plan. And fifth, we learn not to idolize our own children from Isaac's Esau-worshiping botched blessing. Let's pray. God, I thank you so much for who you are, and I ask that if there's anyone in this room right now that doesn't know you and may be feeling a little bit lost right now, that they would know right now that they are welcome, that you want them here, that we want them here, and that really we as humans, we make mistakes. All of us have times of setting a bad example. We sin, we fall short of your glory, God. But the only thing that saves and the only thing that really helps us walk a true and a right path, Lord, is what your Son did on the cross. That you came here in the flesh and gave it all, sacrificed your life in our place to take the consequence that we deserved, which is death, so that you could give us life, and life abundantly, an eternal life. Lord, it's amazing what you've done. And so I do pray for anyone who's here who's maybe been a little lost and maybe doesn't know you, that they would know in this moment that it all starts with a relationship with you. And Jesus, I ask that for the rest of us, we would be able to apply what we've learned, to avoid these mistakes, and to watch over our hearts and to guard them. In Jesus' name, amen.